Surviving the retaking. Mistreatment after the Attica riot. They put a football under my chin. Told me if it dropped, they'd kill me. Court testimony describes what happened next. Cigarette burns. Hot shotgun shells pressed into flesh. Beatings. For 6 hours straight. This was Frank Smith, 300 pounds of muscle, respected by everyone inside. The man inmates chose to keep order during the uprising. The man who saved hostages' lives. And this is what the state of New York did to him after he surrendered. What you're about to see is documented truth. Court records, sworn testimony, medical evidence. The McKay Commission report. September 13th, 1971 started with a massacre. It ended with systematic torture that would take 26 years to expose. Multiple inmates. Different stories. One pattern. According to court documents, this wasn't punishment. It was revenge. The state would spend decades trying to bury what happened in those first 48 hours after the shooting stopped. They almost succeeded. But in 1997, a federal jury would hear the full truth. What they learned would lead to the largest damages award ever given to a prisoner at that time. Most people know about the Attica riot. Almost no one knows what came after. Attica Correctional Facility, Western New York. Maximum security. By September 1971, according to official records, 2,243 men were packed into a prison designed for 1,600. Court documents describe the conditions. 1 shower per week. 1 roll of toilet paper per month. 23 hours in your cell. Former inmates consistently report the same thing. Guards who treated prisoners like animals. Guards who beat inmates in solitary confinement, knowing no one would see. According to the McKay Commission report, released in September 1972, tensions have been building for months. Investigative journalism from the period reveals that in June 1971, inmates submitted a petition. They asked for basic human dignity, better food, medical care, fair treatment. Prison officials added more restrictions instead. Then George Jackson died. Black Panther, political prisoner, shot dead at San Quentin on August 21st, 1971, during what authorities called an escape attempt. At Attica, witnesses reported hundreds of inmates wore black armbands, held a hunger strike. The guard got nervous. The administrators got angry. And on September 8th, testimony shows 2 inmates horseplayed in the yard. Guards overreacted, dragged both men to Housing Block Z. Court records indicate that throughout the night of September 8th, inmates in a block could hear screaming. The next morning, September 9th, 1971, prisoners refused to go back to their cells after breakfast. A gate with a faulty bolt gave way, and 1,281 men took over Attica Correctional Facility. This wasn't just a riot. Court testimony and observer accounts make that clear. The prisoners organized, elected spokesmen, drafted demands, created security teams to protect the 42 guards and staff they'd taken hostage. According to multiple witness statements, Smith personally prevented other inmates from harming hostages. One observer, Assemblyman Arthur Eve, later testified that Smith showed more concern for the hostages' safety than some prison officials showed for the inmates. For 4 days, negotiations continued. Prison Commissioner Russell Oswald agreed to 28 of the prisoners' demands. Better food, religious freedom, fair wages, basic human rights. But they couldn't agree on one thing: amnesty. The inmates wanted a guarantee: no reprisals for the uprising, no legal prosecution, no beatings. According to documented phone records between President Richard Nixon and Governor Nelson Rockefeller, Nixon told Rockefeller, "I just back you to the hilt." Nixon wanted to send a message. Rockefeller wanted to show strength. Neither man ever went to Attica to see the situation for themselves. On September 13th, at 9:43 a.m., the McKay Commission report documents helicopters dropped tear gas into D Yard. 3 minutes later, state police and corrections officers opened fire. They fired nearly 2,000 rounds in 6 minutes into tear gas clouds. What they couldn't see, where hostages and inmates stood together. By 10:30 a.m., it was over. 39 people were dead, 29 inmates, 10 hostages. According to the Monroe County Medical Examiner, Dr. John Edland, autopsies proved one thing the state didn't want anyone to know. Every single person killed that morning died from state police bullets. Not one hostage had their throat cut, despite what corrections officials told the media. But the real horror hadn't started yet. The shooting was just the beginning. What happened in the next 48 hours would take decades to bring to light. If this story matters to you, subscribe now, because what you're about to hear has been deliberately buried for far too long. Court testimony from multiple inmates describes what happened immediately after the gunfire stopped. They were forced to strip naked, lie face down in the mud, some in pools of blood. Then came Rule 1, the reprisal. According to sworn testimony from dozens of inmates, corrections officers walked through the yard with lists. They were looking for leaders, spokesmen, anyone who'd spoken to the media during negotiations. Witnesses reported hearing officers ask, "Where's Big Black? Where's that nigger?" The McKay Commission report found evidence that certain inmates were systematically singled out for special treatment. Court records show that officers used racial slurs while identifying targets. They made it clear this was personal. Multiple depositions describe what came next, what former inmates call the gauntlet. Testimony indicates that corrections officers and state troopers lined up in 2 rows, armed with batons, clubs, axe handles. Naked prisoners were forced to run between them. Some crawled, some tried to run. Officers beat them either way. One inmate testified that a state trooper kicked him when he didn't move fast enough. Another described being hit repeatedly in the testicles while trying to cover his head. National Guard officers later testified to the McKay Commission that they witnessed doctors kicking wounded inmates who were bleeding out on the ground. Doctors kicking bleeding men. That's in the official record. According to court filings and medical testimony, 90 inmates were seriously wounded during the assault. They were shot, some multiple times. Injuries to major organs. Shattered bones. The McKay Commission report documents that these wounded men were initially denied medical treatment. Why? Court testimony suggests it was deliberate. Some inmates bled for hours before receiving care. Others testified that when doctors finally arrived, they witnessed guards beating injured prisoners. One inmate with a femur shattered by a bullet testified that a trooper ordered him to walk. When he couldn't, according to his deposition, the trooper jammed a screwdriver into his rectum and forced him to crawl. Several inmates, medical records indicate, bled to death from treatable wounds. Not because help wasn't available, because help was deliberately withheld. But here's what most people don't know. The torture didn't stop when cameras left. According to the McKay Commission, within hours of the retaking, corrections officials held a press conference. Gerald Houlihan, the public information officer for the New York Department of Corrections, told reporters that inmates had slit the throats of the dead hostages. One hostage, he claimed, had been castrated. The very next day, the Monroe County Medical Examiner confirmed no hostages had their throats cut. All died from gunshot wounds. State police gunshot wounds. But the lie had already circulated worldwide, and it gave corrections officers justification for what they did next. Court documents reveal that the worst torture happened behind closed doors. Testimony from multiple inmates describes a pattern: being taken to isolated cells, beaten, burned, threatened. According to depositions, some inmates were urinated on. Others were subjected to sexual violence. The McKay Commission later found that the New York State Police failed to collect evidence properly. Important omissions. Convenient oversights. In 1975, a whistleblower on the prosecution team, Special Deputy Attorney General Malcolm Bell, sent a 160-page report to Governor Hugh Carey. The report alleged that Bell's superiors were actively covering up criminal actions by police and corrections officers. When Bell tried to investigate and pursue indictments, testimony shows he was reassigned, then suspended. By 1975, according to court records, here's what had happened. 62 inmates indicted on 1,289 criminal counts. 42 separate indictments. 6 trials. 5 acquittals. 1 conviction. 1 single state trooper charged with reckless endangerment. According to later investigations by Special Prosecutor Bernard Meyer At least 65 to 70 law enforcement shooters were subject to possible indictment for murder, attempted murder, and other felonies. None were charged. The McKay Commission report, published September 1972, called this the bloodiest one-day encounter between Americans since the Civil War, with the exception of the Indian massacres in the late 19th century. And the state prosecuted the victims. In December 1975, investigator Bernard Meyer released his report on the prosecution. Volume 1 was made public. It contained findings and methodology. Volumes 2 and 3 contained something different, graphic witness statements describing the reprisals, the torture, the sexual violence, the deliberate brutality. In January 1981, New York State Supreme Court Justice Frederick Marshall ordered those volumes permanently sealed. The full testimony of what happened to hundreds of men would remain hidden for decades. But a handful of survivors refused to give up. What you're about to hear is testimony that was suppressed for over 20 years. If you want to understand how systems protect themselves, even when they're guilty of torture, then stay with this story. Like this video if you think these survivors deserve to be heard. Let's talk about the men whose names appeared on those lists. The ones marked for special treatment. These are real people, real testimony, real pain. Before September 9th, according to prison records, Frank Smith was inmate hashtag 26-880, sent to Attica in 1968 for robbing a dice game in New York City. He was massive, 300 pounds. Everyone called him Big Black. When the uprising started, court testimony shows the other inmates elected him security chief. His job, keep order, protect the hostages. Multiple witness statements, including from hostages themselves, confirm that Smith saved lives during those 4 days. He organized teams to guard the hostages, made sure they got food and water, prevented other inmates from harming them. Assemblyman Arthur Eve testified that Smith showed remarkable leadership during negotiations, kept things calm when tensions rose. Commissioner Russell Oswald later acknowledged that Smith helped maintain order. But after the shooting stopped, according to Smith's own testimony given in federal court, corrections officers were looking for him. Smith's court deposition describes what happened. Officers knocked him to the ground, kicked him, dragged him while calling him racial slurs. "You had your day, nigger, and now this is our day," officers told him, according to his sworn testimony. They forced him onto a table in the middle of the yard, naked, in front of hundreds of other inmates. His testimony continues. They placed a football under his chin, told him if it dropped, they would kill him. For 6 hours, court records show, Smith lay on that table while officers tortured him. They burned him with cigarettes and hot shotgun shells. They beat him in the testicles. They spit on him. They threatened to castrate him, claiming he'd done the same to officers. Smith's deposition describes hearing officers say they were going to kill him, that he'd cut throats, castrated guards. All lies. But the lies gave them permission to continue. According to his testimony, after hours on the table, his legs went numb. They dragged him to a hallway. There he testified they forced him through the gauntlet, the same one other inmates described. Rows of officers with batons. But they weren't done. Court testimony indicates that later, officers took Smith to another location, beat him until both wrists were broken. Then, according to his sworn statement, they played Russian roulette with a gun pressed to his head. Click, click, click. Testimony suggests this went on for hours. National Guard soldiers testified to witnessing continued abuse of Smith. One soldier reported that officers seemed to take pleasure in his pain. Smith survived. Barely. He was released on parole in 1973 after serving 8.5 years of his sentence. But the trauma never left. In a moment, you'll learn what Smith did next. How a man tortured for 6 hours became the leader of a 26-year legal battle. But first, you need to understand, he wasn't alone. In another documented case, one inmate, we'll call him TL, was shot 3 times during the assault. According to his deposition testimony, once in the chest, once in the leg, once in the back. He testified that after being shot, he lay in D-yard for hours, bleeding, watching other wounded men around him. Medical records corroborate his account. He received no treatment for approximately 4 hours. When doctors finally arrived, his testimony describes, guards were still beating inmates, even the ones who were wounded. TL testified that he heard guards tell doctors to leave certain inmates alone, to let them suffer. He survived his wounds, but court documents show he suffered permanent damage from the delayed medical care. Nerve damage, chronic pain, psychological trauma, and he was one of dozens with similar stories. Multiple depositions describe the gauntlet in nearly identical terms. One inmate, referenced in court records as JR, testified that after being forced to strip naked, officers made him run through 2 lines of guards. According to his testimony, they beat him with batons across his back, legs, and head. When he fell, he said, they kicked him and ordered him to keep moving. Another inmate's testimony describes being forced to crawl through broken glass while officers struck him with nightsticks. A third inmate testified that an officer placed a baton against his throat and threatened to kill him if he didn't crawl faster. The McKay Commission report notes that these accounts were disturbingly consistent across multiple witnesses. This wasn't random violence. This was systematic, organized, deliberate. Some testimony is harder to describe, but it's documented, under oath, in federal court. Multiple inmates testified to experiencing sexual violence during the reprisals. Let's talk about some of them. According to medical testimony compiled during the civil lawsuit, dozens of wounded inmates were left untreated for extended periods. One inmate's deposition describes being shot in the abdomen during the assault. He testified that he lay in D-yard watching officers walk past him for over 3 hours before receiving medical attention. When paramedics finally arrived, according to his testimony, a corrections officer told them, "Let that one wait." He nearly died from blood loss. Medical records corroborate his account. His injuries required emergency surgery that was delayed by nearly 5 hours. Court documents reveal that after the uprising, approximately 70 inmates identified as leaders were placed in solitary confinement. According to testimony collected during the lawsuit, these men spent 8 months in segregation. One inmate's deposition describes the conditions: 24 hours a day in a cell, 1 change of underwear per week, no shoes, minimal food. But according to multiple testimonies, the isolation wasn't the worst part. Witnesses reported that corrections officers would enter cells at night and beat inmates. One deposition describes officers opening cell doors at 2 a.m., dragging an inmate out, and beating him in the hallway where other prisoners could hear but not see. According to court records, these beatings continued for weeks after the initial reprisal period ended. The McKay Commission documented something else. Inmates weren't just abused at Attica. According to the Commission's findings, many Attica inmates were transferred to other New York prisons, particularly Auburn Correctional Facility and Clinton Correctional Facility. Testimony from inmates at these facilities describes similar treatment. One former Auburn inmate testified that when Attica transfers arrived, guards lined up and beat them during intake. They told us, "This is what you get for Attica," according to his deposition. The violence spread beyond Attica's walls. Now here's something most people don't know. Not everyone in the system wanted the cover-up to succeed. Malcolm Bell was a prosecutor. His job: investigate crimes committed during the Attica Uprising. According to his own 160-page report sent to Governor Hugh Carey in May 1975, Bell discovered something alarming. His superiors, including the head of the Attica Task Force, were actively preventing him from investigating law enforcement crimes. Bell's report documents specific incidents. When he tried to pursue indictments against corrections officers for torture, he was told to focus on inmates instead. When he collected evidence of beatings, his supervisors allegedly reassigned him. When he persisted, according to court records, he was suspended. According to his report and later testimony, Bell identified at least 65 to 70 law enforcement shooters who could potentially be charged with murder or attempted murder. He documented systematic beatings of inmates after the assault ended. He found evidence that state police had deliberately failed to collect evidence that might incriminate officers, and he reported all of this up the chain of command. His reward? Professional isolation and eventual dismissal from a case. but his 160-page report survived. It would become crucial evidence decades later. After Bell's whistleblower report, Governor Carey appointed Judge Bernard S. Meyer as Special Deputy Attorney General to investigate the allegations. Meyer's assignment: determine if there was a cover-up. In December 1975, according to court records, Meyer released his findings in 3 volumes. Volume 1 was made public. Meyer concluded that while there were serious errors in judgment, no intentional cover-up had occurred. But he also found important omissions on the part of the state police in gathering evidence. And he documented that the prosecution was severely imbalanced. 62 inmates charged, essentially 0 law enforcement personnel. Volumes 2 and 3 contain the detailed testimony, the graphic descriptions, the evidence of systematic torture. Those volumes were never released to the public. In January 1981, a New York State Supreme Court justice ordered them permanently sealed. Why? According to legal analysts who studied the case, the testimony was so damning that releasing it would have forced criminal prosecutions of corrections officers and state troopers. The state chose silence instead. While prosecutors were covering up the truth, a small group of civil rights lawyers was building a case. Elizabeth Fink was a young Brooklyn lawyer when the Attica civil lawsuit was filed in 1974. According to later interviews and profiles, she didn't plan to spend the next 26 years on one case. But that's exactly what happened. Court records show that Fink became the lead attorney for the Attica brothers. She coordinated testimony from hundreds of inmates, fought through endless delays, and faced judges who openly opposed the case. One judge, according to legal historians, deliberately delayed the trial for 18 years through procedural tactics. Fink outlasted him. According to Daniel Myers, one of the attorneys who worked with Fink, the state strategy was simple: paper them out of court, file endless motions, create delays, hope the inmates would give up or die. Many did die. According to settlement records, by 2000, dozens of the original 1,281 plaintiffs had passed away without seeing justice. But Fink and her team adapted. They built relationships with the Attica brothers. Frank Smith worked out of Fink's Brooklyn office, according to testimony from colleagues. They gathered new evidence as it became available. They waited for judges to retire and new ones to be assigned. And in 1991, 17 years after filing, they finally got a trial date. According to court transcripts, the trial was intense. The state argued that the use of force was necessary and that any reprisals were isolated incidents by individual officers. The plaintiffs presented testimony from dozens of inmates describing systematic torture. They showed medical evidence of injuries consistent with beatings. They presented Malcolm Bell's whistleblower report. They demonstrated the prosecution imbalance. 62 inmates indicted versus 1 trooper. In February 1992, after months of testimony, the jury returned a partial verdict. They found Deputy Warden Carl File liable for the reprisals described at trial. They couldn't reach consensus on the other defendants, but it was enough. The jury had confirmed what the Attica brothers had been saying for 20 years. The torture was real. The state was responsible. After the liability verdict, court records show the case moved to the damages phase. This meant individual trials to determine how much each plaintiff should receive. The first major damages trial was Frank Smith's in May 1997. According to news coverage from the time, Smith took the stand and described the 6 hours of torture in detail. The jury awarded him $4 million. But hundreds of other inmates still waited for their day in court. After Smith's verdict, according to legal observers, the state realized it would lose case after case. Individual damages trials could cost hundreds of millions. In March 1992, settlement negotiations began. For 8 years, lawyers negotiated. Plaintiffs filled out questionnaires describing their treatment and its lasting impact. Finally, in January 2000, a settlement was reached. $8 million divided among 502 qualifying inmates and estates. $4 million for attorney fees. The amounts varied based on the severity of suffering documented. Some inmates received a few $1,000s. Others received significantly more. The state admitted no liability, but they paid. And after 26 years, the Attica civil case was closed. Elizabeth Fink continued practicing law until her death in 2015. According to colleagues, she became an encyclopedic source of Attica knowledge for documentarians, writers, and historians. She ensured that key evidence, including photographs of the abuse, would be made public after her death. Heather and Thompson, author of Blood in the Water, said of Fink, "You couldn't write a book about Attica without talking to Liz." Fink's life's work ensured that the story wouldn't be forgotten. There's another group of victims we haven't talked about enough. The hostages, the corrections officers and staff who were killed during the assault, and their families. According to the McKay Commission, 10 hostages died during the September 13th assault. All were killed by state police gunfire, not by inmates. Their families were told they died heroes, which was true, but they weren't told the whole truth, that the state's own forces killed them during an assault that the McKay Commission later called poorly planned and unnecessarily violent. For years, according to news reports, hostages' families fought for recognition and compensation. They felt forgotten. While the state paid millions to defend itself in the inmates' lawsuit, hostage families received minimal support. Here's something remarkable. According to testimony from Assemblyman Arthur Eve Frank Big Black Smith, the man tortured for 6 hours, advocated for the hostages' families. He told me, "I hope and pray we can resolve this for the forgotten victims, the widows, and the guards," Eve recalled in an interview. Smith understood that the real enemy wasn't the individual corrections officers who died. It was the system that put everyone, inmates and guards, in an impossible situation, then responded with violence and cover-up. In March 2001, according to New York State Archives, Governor George Pataki appointed an Attica task force. Their mission: investigate issues raised by the forgotten victims of Attica, a group representing former hostages and families of the 11 employees killed. But as of the making of this documentary, full resolution for hostages' families remains complicated. The system that failed the inmates also failed the guards. Remember Frank Big Black Smith? The man tortured for 6 hours on a table with a football under his chin? After he was released on parole in 1973, court records show he didn't disappear. He did something extraordinary. According to documentation from the Attica Defense Committee, Smith became a leader of the organization defending prisoners charged with crimes during the Uprising. He worked alongside lawyers, helped coordinate the defense of the Attica brothers. But he also did something else. In 1974, survivors of the Attica Uprising filed a massive civil rights lawsuit, 1,281 inmates, against Governor Rockefeller, Commissioner Oswald, Warden Vincent Mancusi, and other state officials. The lawsuit alleged torture, cruel and unusual punishment, systematic civil rights violations. Smith became a driving force behind that case. According to court records, the legal fight took 26 years. The state fought them every step of the way. In 1981, investigative records, volumes 2 and 3 of the Meyer Report, were permanently sealed. Judges opposed to the case caused delays, motions, endless paperwork. But Smith and the other Attica brothers refused to give up. Their lead attorney was Elizabeth Fink, a Brooklyn civil rights lawyer who dedicated her life to this case. Daniel Myers and others joined her. According to Fink's later interviews, Smith became more than a client. He became a colleague, a partner. He had a PhD in life, Fink said. He was smarter than the rest of us. Smith worked out of Fink's law office in Brooklyn, helped organize testimony, coordinated with other survivors. Finally, in 1991, the case went to trial in federal court. It took 18 years just to get there. In February 1992, according to court records, a jury returned a partial verdict. They found Deputy Warden Carl File liable for the reprisals described in testimony. The jury couldn't reach a consensus on the other defendants, but the verdict was enough. It proved what survivors have been saying for 20 years. The torture was real. The state was liable. In May 1997, Frank Smith's individual damages trial began. Court records show that his testimony about the 6 hours of torture was brought to light in full detail. The football under his chin, the cigarette burns, the beatings, the threats, the Russian roulette. Medical evidence supported his claims. Other witnesses corroborated parts of his story. The jury deliberated, and then they awarded him $4 million in damages. According to news reports from 1997, it was the largest verdict ever awarded to a prisoner in United States history at that time. Frank Smith, the man tortured for 6 hours, had won. But he didn't stop there. After Smith's verdict, court records show settlement negotiations accelerated. In January 2000, 26 years after the original lawsuit was filed, the state of New York agreed to settle. $8 million divided among 502 inmates and estates of deceased victims. For $1 million for legal fees. According to the settlement terms, the state admitted no liability, but they paid anyway. According to those who knew him, Smith fought for more than just compensation. Assemblyman Arthur Eve testified that Smith wanted fair treatment for everyone, including the families of the slain guards. He told me, "I hope and pray we can resolve this for the forgotten victims, the widows and the guards," Eve recalled. Smith worked as a youth and drug counselor in New York City, did legal work, mentored young people. He died in 2004 from cancer. He was 71 years old. His attorney, Elizabeth Fink, died in 2015, but their work exposed the truth. So here's the twist. The thing most people never learned. The Attica Uprising ended in 6 minutes. The torture lasted for weeks, and the cover-up lasted for decades. Let's review what actually happened. 43 people killed during the retaking. 29 inmates. 10 hostages, all by law enforcement gunfire. For additional deaths before September 13th. 89 people wounded by gunfire. 128 people shot in total. Nearly 2,000 rounds fired in 6 minutes into clouds of tear gas. According to the McKay Commission, 0 hostages were killed by inmates during the assault. The state's narrative that inmates cut throats and castrated guards was proven false within 24 hours. But here's what took 26 years to officially confirm. 62 inmates were indicted. According to later investigations, at least 65 to 70 law enforcement personnel were subject to possible murder charges. Only 1 state trooper was indicted for reckless endangerment. In 1975, Prosecutor Malcolm Bell was suspended for trying to investigate law enforcement crimes. In 1981, crucial testimony was permanently sealed. In 1992, a federal jury confirmed constitutional rights violations. In 2000, the state paid $8 million but admitted no wrongdoing. The Attica Uprising is often called a turning point in prison reform. The McKay Commission made sweeping recommendations: treat prisoners with dignity, improve conditions, end racism, provide education. So what actually changed? According to prison reform advocates, in 1971, New York had 12 state prisons. By 2021, it had 50. The prison population grew from about 300,000 nationwide in 1970 to over 2.4 million today. Mass incarceration accelerated. But here's what also happened. Attica became a symbol, a rallying cry. The uprising sparked rebellions in at least 13 other prisons across the United States. It exposed the brutal reality of America's prison system. It showed that prisoners could organize, demand rights, fight back. And it proved that even when the state uses overwhelming force, the truth eventually comes out. In 2021, on the 50th anniversary of the uprising, new documentaries were released. HBO's Betrayal at Attica featured previously suppressed testimony, including full depositions from Frank Smith and other survivors. The testimony that had been sealed for decades was finally made public. What does that tell you? For 50 years, the state fought to keep this story buried. They sealed evidence, dismissed charges, delayed trials. They prosecuted victims, protected perpetrators. They spent millions in taxpayer money fighting compensation claims. Why? Because what happened at Attica wasn't an aberration. It was, and is, how the system works when it thinks no one is watching. If this documentary exposed something you didn't know about America's prison system, do one thing. Share it. The Attica brothers fought for 26 years to make sure their story was told. Don't let that fight be forgotten. Subscribe for more documentaries that challenge what you think you know about history. Attica survivors testified to systematic torture. Federal juries confirmed it. Medical evidence supported it. The state eventually paid for it. But no one, not a single corrections officer or state trooper, was ever held criminally accountable for what happened after the shooting stopped. Frank Big Black Smith spent 6 hours on a table with a football under his chin, burned with cigarettes, beaten, threatened with death. He fought for 26 years to expose the truth, and he won $4 million. But the officers who tortured him, according to court records, they retired with pensions. The McKay Commission report, published in 1972, concluded that Attica was the bloodiest one-day encounter between Americans since the Civil War, with the exception of the Indian massacres in the late 19th century. That's an official government report. They also concluded that Governor Rockefeller should not have used armed force without first appearing at the scene and ensuring all alternatives had been exhausted. That's also in the report. But Rockefeller faced no consequences. He became Vice President of the United States in 1974. Prison Commissioner Russell Oswald, who oversaw the negotiations and retaking, remained in his position. According to civil rights historians, this set a precedent. Overwhelming force against prisoners, followed by immunity for those who carry it out. Want to know the scariest part? This keeps happening. In 2015, according to investigations, New York prisons were still dealing with allegations of systematic abuse. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, inmates across the country protested deadly conditions and lack of medical care, the same issues that sparked Attica. In 2021, multiple states reported uprisings in prisons where conditions had deteriorated during the pandemic. The names change. The prisons change. The specific circumstances change. But the pattern remains. Abuse, uprising, violent response, cover-up, years of legal battles, minimal accountability. Today, Attica Correctional Facility is still operating. According to a 2021 investigation by the Marshall Project, many of the problems that sparked the 1971 uprising, overcrowding, inadequate health care, racial tensions, persist in prisons across America. Some former Attica inmates who survived the 1971 uprising are still alive. Tyrone Larkins, shot 3 times during the assault, was released in 1997 after 29 years of incarceration. He earned a college degree through Marist College while inside. In 2021 interviews, he described still being haunted by what happened 50 years ago. Hearing Frank's voice took me back 50 years, he said during a Democracy Now! Interview on the anniversary. So let's be honest about what Attica accomplished and what it didn't. What changed? Some prison conditions improved nationally. More educational and recreational programs were added. There's greater awareness of prisoners' rights. The Attica uprising became a symbol of resistance. What didn't change? Mass incarceration accelerated dramatically. The U.S. prison population grew from 300,000 to 2.4 million. Accountability for prison abuse remains elusive. The fundamental power imbalance remains. The Attica uprising didn't end mass incarceration. In some ways, according to prison historians, it may have even accelerated the move toward harsher sentencing and more secure facilities. But it did something else. It showed that prisoners could organize, could articulate demands, could force the nation to pay attention. And it created a permanent record of what happens when the state uses unlimited force against its own citizens. So here's what you have to ask yourself. If torture happens inside a prison and the state covers it up for 26 years, if victims have to fight for decades just to be believed, if juries confirm the abuse but no one is held accountable, if the same patterns keep repeating in different prisons, different states, different decades, then what else is happening right now that we don't know about? According to Bureau of Justice Statistics, approximately 2.3 million people are currently incarcerated in the United States. Most are in facilities where the public can't see what happens, where guards and inmates exist in a closed system with minimal oversight, where violence, both by inmates and by staff, can occur without witnesses. How many Frank Smiths are there right now? How many are being tortured while we speak? How many are fighting legal battles that will take decades? We don't know. But Attica taught us one thing. The Attica brothers wanted you to know this. Silence protects the system. Attention disrupts it. And truth eventually exposes it. When Frank Smith was tortured for 6 hours with a football under his chin, he could have given up. When he was released in 1973, he could have disappeared. When the lawsuit dragged on for year after year, he could have accepted a small settlement and walked away. He didn't. He fought for 26 years. Won. And forced the state to admit what it had done. Not through violence. Through persistence. Documentation. The refusal to be silenced. That's the real lesson of Attica. In 2021, according to news reports, some politicians and corrections officials objected to the release of new Attica documentaries. They said it was reopening old wounds. They wanted to move forward without dwelling on the past. But here's what they don't understand. This is an ancient history. Many Attica survivors are still alive, still dealing with trauma, still fighting for recognition. The systems that enabled the torture at Attica, qualified immunity for law enforcement, lack of prison oversight, the presumption that inmates are lying, are still in place. And new incidents keep happening. So when someone says that was 50 years ago, let it go, they're really saying, let's forget so it can happen again. There is no national memorial for the Attica Uprising. No monument for the 43 people killed. No official recognition of the torture that followed. According to those who were there, that's intentional. The state doesn't want to memorialize what it did. But the Attica brothers created their own memorial, 26 years of testimony. Court records, sworn statements, medical evidence, an archive of truth that can't be erased. Frank Big Black Smith died in 2004 from cancer. He was 71 years old. Before he died, according to his attorney Daniel Myers, he was watching news coverage of U.S. forces torturing prisoners at Abu Ghraib in Iraq. He was angry. He saw the same patterns, the same denials, the same cover-ups. His last message, according to those who knew him, Attica means fight back. Not with violence, but with truth, with persistence, with a refusal to be silenced. Because the moment we forget what happened at Attica is the moment it becomes possible again. The Attica Uprising began on September 9th, 1971. The massacre happened on September 13th, 1971. The torture continued for weeks afterward. The cover-up lasted for decades. The fight for justice took 26 years. But the truth is permanent. And as long as people remember what Frank Smith and the other Attica brothers endured and survived and exposed, the system can never fully bury it again.